Alright, today we got a video on the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is the late 1800s and early 1900s of America. So let's do it. Number one, what does the word gilded mean? Gilded is different from golden. So golden is like pure gold all the way through. Gilded means that there's like gold on the outside, but if you like took your fingernail and like chipped away at that cage on the left, you would find that there's some sort of other metal, behind it. Maybe, some rusting underneath it, or maybe some, fake green under it. If you ever had fake jewelry, ladies, and it turns green, it looks gold when you buy it, but then it turns green in the end. That's what I'm talking about, okay? And so what I mean by that, and what Mark Twain meant when he was talking about the Gilded Age, and we'll look at that at the end, is he's basically saying that on the outside, America looks like it's doing really good. But if you were to take a deeper look at America and look at the common everyday person, what you'd find is that things aren't so good. That there's a really, really wealthy class that overshadows this, mass of poor people that we'll take a look at when we look at immigration in a more deeper way. But for now, know that there's a few very wealthy and a huge majority of very, very poor. And it is that clash between rich and poor that we're going to be taking a look at. So, we're covering it in gold, so on the outside it looks really nice, but if you take a deeper look, as we'll do, we'll find that things aren't so simple. So on the one hand, you've got someone like this, this painting here of somebody who is ultra wealthy, right? Princess sort of wealth. And then you've got someone like this, who's a gleaner, who picks up garbage for a living. That's what she does. And so you get this real clash between the rich on the one hand and then the poor on the other. And it's such a divide. And what we're starting to see is there's really not this middle class, this, to use a French term, bourgeoisie that we get. We don't really have that. Instead, it's just you're ultra wealthy or you're almost shockingly poor. So you get some people who live in mansions on the left-hand side, and then you get kids sleeping out on the streets on the right-hand side in New York City or Chicago. It's that sort of clash, okay? Feasts on the right, and then you've got her picking up garbage and hoping she gets a meal on the left. And this is sort of the wave, right? We're talking about an era in which there's child labor going on, where a man by the name of Jacob Riis is taking photographs of the immigrant population, where you get this cascading group of immigrants coming through New York City there on Mulberry Street of all different races and all different ethnicities, and you're packing these streets and they're living in tenements. And again, I have a whole video just dedicated to immigration, but just see it now. Treat this video as sort of an introduction into what we're going to be talking about. I know it's a little fuzzy, but again, another mansion. The mansion that you saw was the Vanderbilt Mansion. We'll talk about Cornelius Vanderbilt and his railroad tycoon that he was. I mean, just look at these houses, right? It reminds you of the Palace of Versailles, thinking back to Global 2, right? The Hall of Mirrors kind of style. This elegance and extravagance that you're seeing here. And then you've got a girl who is working in a factory, imagining what her life may or should have been, right? She's just sitting there and she's got to work 12, 14-hour days. You've got coal miners who they're all going to have black lung. They have no future down in the coal mine. They're just trying to make it. And so this is, again, the clash. So the basics of the Gilded Age we define as gold and then rust. So on the one side, you've got, this is the richest time in American history. Right? The most wealth being created coming out of the Civil War, coming out of Reconstruction. We're going to see that capitalism, particularly laissez-faire capitalism, just explodes the U.S. economy. You've got new inventions across the board. You've got skyscrapers and bridges being built, which we call infrastructure. This is America experiencing the Industrial Revolution that, remember, began in Great Britain, and now it's sort of translating over to America, and we're seeing all these new inventions happen. You get the large cities of New York City. You get huge factories being built, and a lot of labor that goes into making those factories a reality. So you can get a job I'm not saying they're good jobs, but you can get a lot of work if you are willing to do some really hard jobs. And you've got these millions of immigrants pouring in. Now, when we're talking about the end of the Gilded Age, we're really talking about the new immigrants, the people from Eastern Europe would be an example, and Southern Europe. So the Italians, the Yugoslavians, okay, those would be like the groups of people that we're seeing. On the other side, you've got the poorest time in American history, and you've got sickness and disease running rampant, because that's what happens when you get a lot of people in a city, right? You get slums developing, or to use a term you might be more familiar with, ghettos, okay, where it's not a nice place to live, and out of these slums you get a lot of gangs. So the gangs are formed for various reasons, but the gangs of New York City, for example. And then this overcrowdedness, to use a technical term, a term that I'd like you to use when you're writing about the Gilded Age, would be urbanization, right? The massive movement from people from farms to cities. In this case, from their homeland, which were farms, to cities. You get unsafe factories. We'll look at an event that changes American history. And you get a lot of child labor, which we spend a lot of time talking about in Global 2, and just to know that that's going to be happening here. And in class, we'll actually look at it in a detailed way through some readings. And keep this in the back of your mind. I'll explore this a lot more, but this is a really important term. To understand American history, you should know this term, nativism. Nativism is the hatred towards immigrants. It's taking all of this nationalistic pride, right, and turning it and saying, not only should you be in this country, you should be an American and learn speak English and all those kind of things, but they actually started to hate other groups. The Irish, for example, would be one whom were hated. The people would actually have flyers put up saying, you know, no Irish need apply. Like, we don't want any Irish people around here. And so you get, on the one side, like a lot of positives, but then on the other, a lot of negatives. And I think the positives, if you were to just be careless in your historical interpretation, you would look at the Gilded Age and say, wow, this is really awesome. You got, you know, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie making all this money, you know, millions of dollars. If you're careful and you're really trying to understand the realities of the Gilded Age, you'll find all of these negatives. Now, part of the Gilded Age, a key part of the Gilded Age, is understanding that the Transcontinental Railroad is being built. And it's really a microcosm of America and a microcosm of the Gilded Age. Because if we look at the Transcontinental Railroad, there's this progress, there's this real building that's going on where it's linking East and West together. And that's going to make a few people, like Vanderbilt, for example, a lot of money, like money hand over fist. But it's also going to provide a lot of work to people, but it's not the type of jobs that you want. This is where the Irish, but also the Chinese, just Asians in general, are working on the railroads, and they're working for meager wages. And it's very dangerous work where they're working with nitroglycerin, which, if you carry nitroglycerin, you have to be extremely careful, because if you tilt it one way or the other, the thing will blow up. So you've got to be super careful. And you've got, like, you know, cave-ins and, you know, the explosions going off before they should. So this is a dangerous labor that you're getting into for not a lot of money. And just please don't forget this, but remember what happens to the buffalo as a result of the Transcontinental Railroad. So these things are happening concurrently and simultaneously, where we're taking over Native American land, forcing them on reservations, where we're exploiting immigrants, but we're doing that in the name of manifest destiny and progress for America. And on the one hand, yes, the economy is going to start booming, but is it good for the majority of people there? I don't think that it's too simple an analysis, right? So, Transcontinental Railroad, a microcosm of the Gilded Age. So here's somebody who exploited and took advantage of the Transcontinental Railroad. His name's Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was smart because he was able to take advantage of the government. The government had this concept of manifest destiny, whether real or not, whether stated or not, I should say. where they wanted to settle west. Well, they also wanted to make sure that people had the ability to settle the West. So here's what they did. They would offer subsidies, loans given to companies that didn't have interest, or at least they were low interest at the very least. But and they would give these loans to people so that they could build those railroads. And the idea is, if you have the startup capital, if you have the initial investment, you can create a business. Well, here's what Cornelius Vanderbilt did. He had a railroad business. And so he used those subsidies, he used those government loans, he used the land given to him by the government, or the cheap land bought from the government, to build his railroad. And it was those initial investments. And then what he had was this huge empire of railroads where he's making all this money. So Cornelius Vanderbilt is an example of what we call a railroad tycoon, somebody who made a lot of money off of the railroads, and $185 billion in today's currency would be Cornelius Vanderbilt. And so what we have here is, and it's kind of interesting, the subsidies contradict this argument, but historians debate the Gilded Age. This is an example of laissez-faire gone out of control. And of course, when I say laissez-faire, you should say hands off, right? You should throw your hands up in the air, hands off, okay? And it's Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, most boring man in history, if you recall that. Well, laissez-faire says that the government shouldn't do anything into the economy. It should back off. And in many ways, they will. They will back off. And that allows some of these companies to become huge and powerful and take over all the smaller companies. The government is not playing, trying to help all these small companies succeed. Instead, they're backing off and they're letting business do what it does. And for all the brutalness that business methods that we'll see. The contradiction here is those subsidies giving out cheap land or giving out low to zero in cost loans. What that'll end up doing is it sort of contradicts laissez-faire, because the government's supposed to be hands off. So when you get somebody, or you're reading some book about the Gilded Age and they say it's an example of laissez-faire, it's like, yeah, for the most part it is, but there are exceptions to that. There are ways where it's not total hands-off, and I don't know that we ever really get there. So maybe a technicality, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So you'll read an article in which we talk about economic Darwinism. Now, we talked about social Darwinism last year when we talked about imperialism, and this is an example of the Opium Wars, right, where all the nations are coming together and carving China into spheres of influence. And we said that social Darwinism was taking survival of the fittest, the argument by Charles Darwin, and flipping it and saying, let's apply that to the human race. And Herbert Spencer was the guy that did it. And he basically said that this is what the story of history has been, and what it should be, is that the strongest nations survive and the weakest die off, and that's the way of the world. It's a horrible and hardened argument to really make, but that's what Herbert Spencer was doing, and a lot of people believe this. Well, what we see in the Gilded Age is you take social Darwinism now and you apply it to the economic sphere. You apply it to business. So the big businesses live on, the small businesses die off. And I will argue throughout this lecture that that's not good for the average person. For like you and I, that's not so good to have a monopoly. Why is it that your internet prices are so high? It's because you have to go through one company. For example, we have Spectrum here, right? There's one company that you have to go to. Any of their competitors really can't compete with their speeds, and so Spectrum has this monopoly control, and as a result, technically, they could just make their prices whatever they want, because there's nobody to really step in. And so there's a danger in having monopolies, and I'll show you how they form, and hopefully show you how to make some money, right? So here we go. Big business. This is after the Civil War. What we start to come up with is a situation where businesses want to take advantage, grow, expand, even start to build into the South. And one way to do that is to become a corporation. And so what you do as a corporation is you take yourself, your business, and you put it on the market. You put it as a public sphere where people can buy into your company. Those people that buy into your company are called shareholders, or as we say, stockholders, right? And you can buy a piece of your company, what we call a stock. there's a risk in that. So you buy a part of the company. Now, if the company improves, so let's say that you go and you make yourself a corporation and you say that you're going to have 100 shares of a stock and you're going to sell them at $1 a share. 100 shares, $1 a share. So what I could do is I could buy, 10 shares of your company for $10, okay? And I go ahead and I do that. Well, if your company makes more and more money, then obviously what will happen is your corporation is worth more. So now your stock goes from $1 a share to, say, $2 a share, okay? If that happens, I can now look at my stocks and say, I have 10 stocks here. I bought them for $1, but now the company's worth $2 a share, so I've essentially doubled my money. That's really good. Conversely, if your company doesn't do so well and your stocks go down, your company worth goes down to 50 cents a share, well, then I just lost half of the money I put up, right? Instead of, the $10 investment I made, I'd really only be making $5 back. So it's, I don't want to say legalized gambling, but kind of, right? Where you're putting money in, you're betting that this company is going to be successful, and you're hoping that that happens. Okay, this is big business in a nutshell. So these corporations become very, very powerful, and what the corporations start to do is they start to develop a monopoly, where when they start to do better, they start to buy out other companies or buy out companies that make their product. We'll talk about the differences between those things. And essentially what they do is corner the market, and they try to become the one company that dominates that market. So they're the one company that sells oil, the one company that sells steel, the one company that has developed, telegraph lines, okay? That's their thing, and you have to come to them and buy from them. It's the game that everyone, loves and hates at the same time because it takes way too long. But the game of Monopoly, what's that goal? It's the goal is to own all the property on the board. And if you can do that, then you can charge the most money, ridiculously, right? If you own Boardwalk, you can charge this ridiculous amount of rent when people pass along. So that's the concept, that's the idea, and the goal is for you to own the whole board. In this case, the goal is to own an entire industry. And when I say an industry, I'm talking like oil industry, steel industry, right? The farming industry, right? Things like that. Now, a trust is a little bit different. And this is a tougher thing to say. We'll do it in class, a really big demonstration of what a trust is. But it's essentially when a corporation is big, and there's another corporation in the same market, like two big oil companies, okay? A trust is brilliant, but also really, really devious. And what the two companies will do, these two corporations, what they'll do is they'll have a backdoor meeting in which they agree. So Company A and Company B. Company A agrees to sell oil at $2 a gallon, right? And Company B does the same thing. They say, okay, we'll sell at $2 a gallon. What they're doing is they're like splitting the market between themselves, and they're trying to defeat the competition that has to sell at $3 a gallon, right? So they lower their prices down. And then often what a trust will do is when they lower their prices down and they agree to buy a certain amount of oil and sell that amount of oil, they're agreeing that each side's gonna, it's $2. So no matter where they go, they're both getting a share of the market. When all the little companies die out because they can't compete with the $2 a gallon oil, what they'll do then is they'll agree to raise it, and they'll raise it to $5 a gallon, right? So that now they're both making like double the money that they were making before, and they're really, really cornering the market at this point. And no one else can go to them because all of the other companies have died off. A trust, again, it's brilliant, but it's also very devious. It's also kind of evil for the consumer, But it worked really, really well during the Gilded Age. So an example of someone who did trust would be John D. Rockefeller, and he grew up in Richford, New York. And if you don't, there's John D. Rockefeller, a young guy there. There's Richburg, New York. It's really not too far from Buffalo, not too far from Lawrence, New York, if we're thinking about it. And John D. Rockefeller, besides Mansa Musa, really is like the wealthiest guy that I can tell you about, that I know about, in all of history. Like thinking humanity. He is that wealthy, guys. So, and he came from New York. Keep that in the back of your mind, will you? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about his story. John D. Rockefeller, if you look at him right there, he's got like the same look. Just take a look at all three images there. Right, at 18, at 40, and 97. Guy like never smiled. And I guess I want to tell you why someone who is amazingly wealthy would like never smile. It's a sad story, but it's one that I think you need to hear in order to understand the man behind the millions. Maybe billions is a better word. John D. Rockefeller, born in Richburg, New York. He grew up with a mother and a father that were quite different. His mother loved John to his grave. She loved him, wanted to make sure that he was, raised well. But his father was never around. His father, in fact, was a schemer. His father was somebody who took advantage of people, right? And what he would do is he had these things called elixirs, okay? An elixir was supposed to, like, be a cure to some disease or help you live longer. And often these elixirs were made of oil, okay? Just keep that in the back of your mind. And I think it's important later on. Really ironic. And so his father would go door to door, and he would try to scam people. He would try to scam them to buy elixirs. He'd go to like people who were like generally older, whom had medical concerns of some sort, or on their way, to retirement and had some extra money, and he would try to take advantage of these people and get them to buy elixirs. And so when he would do that, they would, naturally, when they bought the elixirs, because he's really good at talking to people, they found out that these things didn't work, that they were just a bunch of hocus pocus, totally wrong, and never really worked. And so they would come back to John, and John's father, and they'd say, you sold me this elixir, how dare you, I want my money back. And of course, here's what would happen next. John and the family would have to move, because he was always scamming people. And so, John's father would like leave for times, or he'd make the kids move. And so it was this really horrible situation where he didn't really have this permanent living situation. His father was never around. His father would often go place to place, woman to woman. He was not faithful to John's mother at all. And he would just like show up, guys. He would just come in one day. It's like, Dad's home. It's like, he hasn't been home for 3 months, you know what I mean? And he really started to develop, I don't want to say hate, but certainly resentment towards his father. And so John had this situation where it's like, what do you do as a kid? What do you do with not having a father? And he, John had sisters and brothers that he had to take care of. And so here's what he decided to do. He had to rise to the occasion. And so John took $1, and he'd go down to the local candy store. He'd take this $1, and he'd buy out the candy, buy $1 worth of candy. And if he was buying the candy for a nickel, then he would go back to his neighborhood, which didn't have a candy store right there, and he would sell it. He'd piece it out. Instead of selling it for a nickel, he'd sell it for a dime to the kids, And so he'd go and he'd be selling it to his peers, dime candy, and he'd take all of that money that he had, and then he would do something that his mother taught him. Because, John, he was great with math, he was very hardworking, but his mother instilled something into him. She said, take anything that you make, any profit you make, and reinvest it back into the business, right? So if you doubled your money, you got $2, now take that extra $1, right? Go back to the candy store and invest it again. Now you're getting $2 worth of candy, and make that multiplier effect. Every time, just reinvest back into your company, and you'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's what he did. And any profits that he didn't reinvest, he would put it into a little jar on the table, right in the kitchen table. He had this little jar, and he'd take a little bit. Once he got big enough, once he was making enough money, he'd put it into this little jar on the table. And that little jar was used to buy his sisters, shoes, school supplies, anything that they needed or the family needed. They could dip into that jar. And remember, because it was only his mother and he didn't have a father, their income was very, very limited. But John felt really good. like proud that he could serve his family in this way. Well, one night he's in bed and he hears some like ruckus downstairs, you know, things being moved and all that kind of stuff. So he goes down the stairs and he sees his father down there, Bill, and he's looking up at his son. He's looking up at John, and he says, John. And he puts his hand right into the jar, and he's taking the money right out. John sees it, you know, clear as day. He says, John, never trust anyone, not even me. I think that broke John's heart in some way, but he learned from that. His father took that money, took the family's money, and he left, just left, you know. And John resolved that he would learn from this event. And so what he did next is his father did the usual spiel. He left for a while and then he came back and he was sitting on the couch with John. John was his senior in high school, and he says, John, he says, "I want you to know, I'm really proud of you, son." He's like, "I'm proud that you're going to graduate high school." John just took note of that. Went in the next day to his guidance counselor. He said, "I'm dropping out." The guidance counselor was like, "Why would you do that? You're a senior, you're done, like this is it." He says, "I'm dropping out." And he comes back home and he says to his dad, he says, "Dad," he says, "I dropped out of school." His father's like, "Why would you do that? You're so close, and you can't do that." And John looks him square in the eye and he says, "How does it feel to be disappointed, Dad? How's it feel?" He walks away. John wanted to do something with his life, and so he decided he would get in to a new industry, the oil industry. And he worked with a chemist to really change the game in the oil industry. And what he started to do is he took advantage of people, who were smarter than him in terms of the chemistry aspect. And he learned that, oil could be used for heating instead of using kerosene. And kerosene typically came from whale blubber, and so it's not a really sustainable source. But the oil from the ground, not saying that that's sustainable, by the way, there was a lot to be tapped into. And so he takes advantage of that. He starts to create these companies. Well, he does it through means that maybe aren't so, morally acceptable. And so he actually runs into some issues with a lady named Ida Tarbell, who starts to tell us about how he built this oil empire. And she will publish stories in magazines about how he does these really awful things to stay in power, and goes after Standard Oil. She'd be like a muckraker, as we'll talk about in the next chapter. And he ends up building like this mansion called Kaikut, which is a beautiful place and all that kind of stuff. And here's how he does his business building. Remember how he talked about reinvesting in his company? Well, what John D. Rockefeller would do is he would not only buy out competition, as one way of doing it. He believed in something called vertical integration. And what vertical integration is you buy all the companies that make your finished product. For example, when you're talking about oil, not only do you have to drill for the oil, okay, you have to do that, so you have to have your drilling machines, but you also have to be able to put that oil into barrels. So what he did is he bought a barrel making company, right? So that he could reduce his bottom line. Okay, well that wasn't enough. He said, okay, now I need wood for the barrels, so then I want to buy my own forest. And then he bought his forest so that he could cut down on the price of lumber to make the barrels. Well, those barrels need to be moved, and so he had to get a shipping company, a company that could move the barrels efficiently. And so he did that. He got a shipping company to be able to move his product where it needed to go. And basically what he tried to do is he wanted to own all stages of the company, from the moment that the oil came out of the ground to the moment that it reached the consumer. And if you could do that, if you owned all the stages of the process, you could sell your oil for cheaper than anybody else. Smart, right? And so this vertical integration, where you own all the companies that make your product, is brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And it allowed him to reduce his bottom line. Once he could do that, well, then other companies couldn't compete with him as well. And so then what he would do is he used horizontal integration, where he would then buy out companies on the same level as his. So he would buy out other oil companies and thereby create that monopoly that you're so familiar with, where he owned all of the companies that were making the oil and selling the oil, right? He owned all of that. And what he would do is he would often, because he was such a large company, he was buying out these companies, is he would engage in trusts. And we talked about what a trust is. What he would do is, he would meet with larger oil companies, he'd form a trust. Hey, let's sell all of our oil at $1 a gallon, something really, really cheap. And companies who were selling at $3 a gallon, smaller companies, could not compete with that price. And eventually they would fold. And then what John D. Rockefeller would do is he'd come in and he would buy those companies too. Often, smaller companies don't want to sell to a big one. But if they go bankrupt, then they're forced to sell. And so that's what he would do. He would force guys into bankruptcy, then he'd buy them right out for cheap. It was one of those things where if he came to you with an offer, you probably should take it. Because if you don't, Standard Oil is going to ruin you. And he was able to do that so masterfully. So Ida Tarbell, going back to our muckraker, did not want that to happen, and so she would, condemn him for his practices. We'll see some legislative change later on, but for now, John D. Rockefeller is making a huge living through vertical integration and horizontal integration. Here's some mansions in Newport, Rhode Island. There's our guy, John D. So here's a story card that you should be able to answer. Make sure that you're able to fill that all in for me, okay? That's the story in a nutshell. I talk to my students about the differences between kerosene and gasoline, and it's the heating portion of this stuff. I won't do too much with you guys on this, just to say that he figured out that home heating oil is a really, really important part in the heating game, and that you could do that better than using whale blubber from kerosene. Okay, so what do you need to know? John D. Rockefeller, he's going to start his company out in Cleveland, Ohio. He calls it Standard Oil. Please note that. It becomes a monopoly. I showed you how, through horizontal and vertical integration. So horizontal integration, when you buy out your competitors. Vertical integration is you buy everything that makes your product. Everything that gets you to the finish is what you're going to buy. So, example, buy his own railroad tank cars. Buy your oil pipelines. That's a good one. Barrel making factories. Your own forests. Like, buy everything that's going to make your product and deliver it to the consumer. Now, eventually, by 1890, the government's going to come out with some antitrust laws. Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which wasn't powerful enough, by the way, comes out and it basically says, listen, you can't do this. You cannot agree to sell at a certain price and then hike up your prices. Like, that's unfair to the consumer. And so what their goal was in the Sherman Antitrust Act was to outlaw these things. Here's the problem, guys, and here's where things get a little dirty in politics. They usually didn't go after the bigger trusts because a lot of these trusts would pay for politicians to run their campaigns. And so what you're seeing is politics in bed with business, and it really did not work well for the American consumer because the politicians were either too afraid or very unwilling to go after these larger businesses, these larger trusts. And so Standard Oil, they didn't go after them. They wouldn't. They wouldn't touch John D. Rockefeller because he was so close with politics. And we'll see that there are people who will bail out the American government because they have so much money. John D. Rockefeller is famous in that he starts getting some oil companies out in China during the Boxer Rebellion. And he is the one that tells the American government, listen, you got to go over there and you got to protect my American businesses. You got to do this, America. American military must protect my business. And we do. We go over there and we fight, and that's the first place that we go to, is to go and protect Standard Oil companies because we want to protect John D. Rockefeller's investments. It's like he's having a private military, and no one ever tells you this kind of stuff. So, just to see how politics and business was really working hand in hand during the Gilded Age. It's quite scary. So you end up getting a situation like this, and I think, understanding that little piece of it, you can understand why they have a crown on his head. I mean, he's just all powerful. He's got bags of money below. He's got the oil lamp there on the right-hand side. He's bringing light to the world on the left-hand side. It's this situation where he is a real oil baron, and he is making money hand over fist, and he has the power of the American government behind him. So you're starting to see here's a great example of horizontal and vertical integration at play, where he's got control of everything, not just the companies that are on his level, but the companies that help to make Standard Oil as well. So he's got his hand everywhere, and even in the White House, if you look at the far right, he's got his hands in there too. All right, so we've talked about John D. Rockefeller. Let's just talk about some of the inventions. So I do a little bit better of a job in class telling you about Thomas Edison, but here's the basics. Thomas Edison's mind was working a lot faster than most people's mind. He could do a lot of things very well, and there's a huge controversy, by the way, as to how much of his inventions were his own. I'm not going to really broach that subject, but know that this new interpretation of Thomas Edison is that he stole everybody's ideas. I don't subscribe to that. I think you need a balanced approach when you talk about Thomas Edison. The guy was very, very smart, very, very intelligent. He knew a lot, and had this mind where he could keep a lot of different things in his brain at one time. And so there's a situation where his factory, where he had all of his inventions, he'd have them like all in a line, a bunch of different ones, like 20 different inventions going on at the same time. And he would just go and mess around with them day by day. Well, the whole factory went up. And it was said that Thomas Edison, he's outside of it, and he looks at it and he says, well, it's all up here. Like, it doesn't matter what's going on in that factory. Like, they can all burn up, but all those inventions are in my brain, so I'll just recreate them. Like, it was no big deal or something like that. So, brilliant guy, and he comes up with General Electric, which, if you're familiar, General Electric's in Schenectady. Okay, really, really close to us. It's a huge company. It's, big stock and all that kind of stuff. So he is maybe the most well-known inventor. Between 65 and 1900, over 400,000 patents are given to him. Now, a patent is the ability. It's like taking ownership of an idea and saying, this is my idea and my idea alone, and I can make some sort of invention out of it. So that's a lot of ideas that he had, right? And he will take that stuff and he will create invention after invention. The motion picture projector, the phonograph, the battery, the electric light bulb, all of these different things. Other inventors that you should know about. Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone. And you should know that because you have a smartphone, and it started in 1876 with Graham Bell. Henry Ford, his concept, though not like a direct invention, the Model T and the automobile would be a direct invention, but the assembly line might be just as important because it was applicable to other industries. So you take the assembly line idea and you can use that in other sectors and other jobs, where basically one person has a job. You put on the lug nuts, and then there's another person who says, I'm putting on the headlights. Well, once you put on lug nuts, and that's all you do every day, I mean, it's really boring, but you get really good at that and really fast at that and proficient at it, and you know what to look for. So instead of building one car as like a team and everyone like just kind of pitches in, you do this job and that's all you do. You do this job and you do it for 8 hours. You're fast, you're efficient, and you're really, really intentional at how you do your work. So the assembly line was brilliant. Henry Ford was also brilliant because he paid his workers a livable wage, maybe more than a livable wage. He pays workers really well. And his mindset and his goal behind that is, if I pay my workers really well, first, my workers will talk really good about my company, but number two, my workers will have the money to buy the things that they're making. So my workers will buy my car, and therefore they will spread the message that this car is really good and it works really, really well, and therefore I'll get more people. It's a way of advertising as well, but it has this multiplier effect. treating your workers well and giving them a livable wage will allow them to buy into your company more, and it creates a nice cycle. So Henry Ford was really brilliant in that way. But you get cheaper goods, faster goods, of course, and speed is really the name of the game here with the assembly line. You also have the Wright brothers coming up with the airplane, which will be used in World War I as a scouting feature. So we're starting to see things changing in America, for sure. Oh, where did Ford get that idea? He got it from the slaughterhouses of Chicago. That's the way that they had a de-assembly line where they break apart the animal into the different pieces that they need. So like, the shoulders, the different cuts of meat, and so they would break it down. Well, he said, well, why don't we use that same idea but reverse it and build it up to a car? And so that's a really cool little way to show your history there. Here's a light bulb patent for Thomas Edison. Betty Ness Smith is a really interesting little side note to this whole thing. Never going to come up on the regions, but Betty Ness Smith was a typist whom realized that typewriters were really, really terrible in some ways, because if you made a mistake on a typewriter, it was really difficult to really fix that. Okay, there wasn't a backspace. It was like once the letter's in, the letter's in. And so what she developed, she was at home and she had like this white paint, and she realized that obviously you put white paint on paper, it's too thick. It's a too thick of a coat. So she started to mess around with the formula, like watering it down and different things. And she ended up coming up with a formula whereby she could put this formula on paper, and it was thin enough that it would cover her mistakes, because Betty Ness Smith made a lot of mistakes. And so she came up with this idea and this concept, and it became what we know today as whiteout. And how did she do that? Well, she took nail polish remover and she took some white paint, and she created that whiteout. I think the term she called it at first was mistake out. I think that's what she called it, and then it eventually became whiteout. And how did it happen? Well, Gillette came to her, a company that known for razors, and Gillette came to her and said, "We'd like to buy your company for $46.5 million." And the famous way that it went was Betty Ness Smith, Gillette comes to her and says, "We want to buy your company," and she's like, "No, this is a really great company, like I want to hold on to it." And they're like, "How about $46.5 million?" She's like, "Oh yeah, sure." Definitely. I'll take it. And so this typist made a whole lot of money. And so again, it's this example of the Gilded Age where like she has this rundown job, maybe dead end. She's not making a lot of money. And all of a sudden she's able to come up with an idea that makes her part of that wealthy elite. And so it's not, no social mobility. That's not what I'm arguing here. I'm just saying that there's some social mobility. It's not a lot, but when you move up big, okay? So there's the Gilded Age. So here we go. I'll just say, check out a video on Thomas Edison here. Talks about concrete furniture. It's hilarious. Okay, let's keep going. So one tragedy of the Gilded Age that we should know about, and child labor is a tragedy in itself, but what they did at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was awful. So they had a situation where this was a garment working factory where people were sewing up fabrics and making dresses and shirts and things like that, and jeans and all that kind of stuff. And the men worked in the 7th floor, and the women worked in the 9th floor. And so 7th and 8th floor, and then the 9th floor was the women. And so what they would do is the men were like the specialty cutters, and so they would cut the fabric up and then they'd send it upstairs to the women. And it was very commonplace that you'd be smoking on the job, and that's like really terrible, not just for your health, but it's really terrible because all of the scraps that you have are cotton and they're highly flammable. And so the story goes is that the women are working upstairs on the 9th floor when all of a sudden a man, he's smoking a cigarette, like tosses casually a cigarette into a basket that has a bunch of fabric. Well, little by little, they're not paying attention. It wasn't like they're doing their, labor and stuff like that. And all of a sudden they look and the fire has like broken out. And instead of like stopping the fire or having like water buckets near or something like that, they don't have any of that. They don't. And so what happens is instead of trying to stop the fire, they just go and run out. And it takes them a while. The men, it takes the men a while to run out, and so they're like running out. And all of a sudden, the last guy, the manager, looks back and he sees this like flaming like ball of fabric or something, and he recognizes that the ball of fabric is moving. He recognizes that it's a little boy who has been engulfed by the flames, and he shuts the door. He shuts the door. Like, oh my God. And when he shuts the door, he doesn't go upstairs to save the women. He doesn't go upstairs. He knows, like, this fire is breaking out. He's like, no, I can't. He just doesn't have the strength. He doesn't have the gumption to do it. And so the women are upstairs when all of a sudden the fire starts to break up from downstairs. And the women all rush to the door. Well, the feature of this room, and you see it on the blueprint here, is that there are 2 exits, okay? But the one exit was chained shut, okay? And the other exit had a pull door instead of a push door. And that's really important to understand, guys. The fire escape was rusted, but the one exit that they had, and by the way, there's hundreds of people in this room, okay? If you have 240 machines, that means that there's more than 240 people in the room. And you have all these people upstairs, and so everyone like starts to rush for the doors. Well, what that does is it creates a bottleneck effect where not everyone can get out. If it was a push door, people could just like slam through the push door and go down the stairs. But because it's a pull door, people are getting like, there's not enough space and everyone's running and it's like this mass chaos. And so eventually the fire starts to spread. It covers the stairs now. You can't get out. Well, the women are upstairs. The fire department comes, and the fire department's ladders aren't tall enough to reach the 9th floor. So the women are there. The fire's engulfing them. They have nowhere to go. And the elevator doesn't work or anything like that. So you're in this situation where you're stuck. So the women do the only thing that they can do. Eventually, they start to jump, and they are flying out this window. People are seeing this. 9 stories. They're dropping down, and they're breaking the nets that are down below. It's this horrible, horrible scene. A reporter will write later. He'll say, "I learned a new sound that day. I learned the sound of a speeding body smacking on the ground." It's just a horrible sound. And 146 women died that day. Now, the owners, Isaac, Blank, and Harris, Arthur Harris, I believe, are put on trial in like manslaughter, like your policy. And the policy was that you'd only have one exit, and the other exit would be chained because they wanted to check the employees to make sure they weren't stealing any of the fabric. That was their situation. The fire escapes were in terrible condition. There was no other exits, so they said, you're liable for these deaths. This is manslaughter. You're not having any sprinklers in there. Your policies that you had in place led to the deaths of 146 women. Well, Blank and Harris, because they had really good lawyers, and I don't know how else to explain it, guys, but the legal system failed us, and they end up getting off scot-free. I think they had to pay like a fine of some sort. And they kept on doing this, by the way. They kept on having these horrible fire codes in place, and they got cited later on for the same things that they were doing in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So they never learned their lesson. I want to be very clear on that. So there's the 2 business owners, by the way. And there's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So the girls were placing coffins, small coffins, you know what I mean? And there's them working. A lot of them are just young girls, young immigrant girls. A horrible scene. But here's the results of this, okay? What we did after this is we decided to launch the FIC, the Factory Investigation Committee. And Al Smith and Francis Perkins, Al Smith will later run for president, Al Smith and Francis Perkins worked collaboratively. Francis Perkins would end up being, huge for FDR as a person in his cabinet. And the two worked together, and they went factory to factory, and they would just try to figure out and try to make sure that these factories were up to fire codes. And they established these fire codes through the Factory Investigation Committee, and they found people violating these codes, and they hammered them with fines. And it was said that Al Smith would get in front of the assembly, and he would go on and on and on. He would not stop talking until they got real reformed. And for that's why we have a lot of the things we have in our schools. The push doors, the fire exits, the occupancy numbers where you can't have like more than 200 people, let's say, in the multi-purpose rooms, things like that. It's real change, and it was needed change, but it took a lot of striking, it took a lot of union effort, and it took Al Smith and Francis Perkins demanding change for us to actually realize that there are some real problems in these sweatshops and tenements throughout New York City. Here's Rose Friedman, one of the last survivors who died in 2001. Here's the building today. And there are still problems with fire codes, particularly in Bangladesh. The same thing happened. Door was locked. The people were too high up, and they had to jump out. It was the same situation. So in 2012, this situation happened again. It's just horrible the way that history repeats itself. And here are the interiors of the fires, 1911 to 2012. It's just brutal, absolutely brutal. But I tell you these things because while we did gain some improvements, I want you to know that globally there's still issues with this stuff, and that it's real, and that it matters, and that it hurt people. So I leave you with this: Mark Twain is famous, and that he coins this term, the Gilded Age. He writes in his book, The Gilded Age: A Tale of Today, "The external glitter of wealth conceals a corrupt core that reflects the growing gap between the very rich and the very many poor." If you can explain this quote using specific examples and show me the differences between the very many poor and the very few rich, then I think you've really got this unit. And so I encourage you to try to do that. Show me 3 examples of the very many poor, and be able to show me 3 examples of the very few rich. And I think if you can do that, then you prove to me you understand the Gilded Age. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, guys.